College football nerds here talking Rose Bowl, Alabama, Michigan, round one of the playoff semifinals, if you will, last year of a 14 playoff, and we're going to talk about this matchup. It's a super interesting one. We're probably not going to dive into a lot of the Florida State, Texas, Alabama, who got in, who got screwed. We're not here for that. We're here to talk ball. And I got my nerd Josh here with me. We took a little bit of a break to get things set up for, families and Christmas and actually do a little bit of work. But it's time, Josh, to get nerdy with these people. I want to remind everybody, collegefootballnerds.com. You can check that out for stats, relative performance stats. You can kind of see the model that you can play around with it as much as you want. We're going to talk about that model here. Josh, let's get into this game. For me, you and I were talking about the two matchups in the semifinals, and we both said that, I think we both agree that the way that the matchups laid out, not talking about seeding, but the actual matchups, I think they both set up for better games because, at least to me, I think that Alabama probably beats Washington pretty easily, and I think that Texas is a really tough matchup for Michigan, but you swap those and we've got two pretty interesting games. Why don't you talk about that for a little bit?
It is interesting because there are a lot of specific matchup situations that come into play with different teams. And we've talked about for years how college football tends to be driven by, sort of the new rule changes, RPO, you can score 40 points a game, and how that shifted really the last 2 years where defenses have caught up, the game slowed down, and we've seen more of a shift towards pro-style offenses, towards scheming guys open, that kind of thing. I think Michigan has been a team that was kind of at the forefront of that. I think it was a little bit just who Harbaugh was. But it was the right place at the right time the last 2 years, and I think that's a big part of their transition. Obviously, a lot of stuff being made about why they are where they are. Look, I'm not going to get in the sign-stealing stuff here. If you're a Michigan fan irritated about our coverage of that, it's not something we're going to really talk about at any length right now. It's maybe to some small amount that it's relevant, but it's just mostly not. The important thing is I think their shift in Michigan's ability to play good football had to do with the changes that have happened in college football in terms of adjusting to offenses, and that's caused them to suddenly become a much better program. Alabama, Texas, even, to some extent even Washington have all kind of undergone similar shifts, and what that means is that football is now much more matchup-centric. Alabama has some issues when they play defenses that can really make them work. They've had a tendency to stall. They play up and down a competition, and when they play bad defenses, they can put up a lot of yards and a lot of points. I think Washington would have been a game where Alabama could have kind of run away with it, sort of like they did the LSU game, just because the defense is so good, Washington would struggle to score. And if you can't put up a certain amount of resistance, Alabama's going to run you over. Likewise, Texas's defensive front in this playoff is the best unit, the best defensive front of the four teams, I think, pretty clearly. Maybe even far and away the best defensive front in the country all year long. I think there's a strong argument for that between Sweat and Murphy in particular. And for Michigan and what they want to do, that would have been a very difficult matchup. But in this game between Alabama and Michigan, you get two teams where Michigan is good enough to slow down Alabama. Alabama can do a lot of things offensively that Michigan hasn't seen. We'll talk about that. Stuff like Michigan's pin and pull scheme has been things that Alabama struggled in some of the games that they've struggled to win. And I think it creates for a really interesting set of matchups, a lot of stuff that we've seen to see if they'll overcome, and a lot of things where we don't necessarily know what we're going to get. That's always exciting.
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll get into Texas-Washington here in a second, but, Washington could exploit Texas' secondary. That's their weak point. Alabama's strength is their secondary, and their front is not as good as Texas. Michigan, you mentioned pin and pull. I don't want to get into really where I think the game starts and ends for Michigan, and this is so cliche. And I hate that I have to say this because it sounds like I don't have anything to offer, but it really is the game for me. Michigan needs to run for probably 4 yards a carry in this game. I think that there are teams that could beat Alabama running less than that, but in general for Michigan, they're doing well offensively, and they can put up a number once they get over that 4.5 yard per carry threshold. And the question for me is, are we going to see the Alabama front that really shut down an excellent Georgia offensive line and good run game? Or are we going to see the one that really struggled against Auburn? Now, I know there's some injury situations there with Alabama, with Lawson, and in the secondary with Key, and even on the defensive line. But, Josh, is this a situation where some of it is scheme related, where people have been able to take advantage of Alabama and not so much just getting guys healthy?
I think it's a little column A, a little column B. And something I want to really note about these two teams, if you go back and watch prior performances and you're a fan of the opposing team, you're probably going to pick games that are not necessarily representative of who they are. Alabama had some injury situations early in the year, late in the year. I think it really bit them versus Auburn defensively with Deontay Lawson. Watching tape, I've studied these two teams pretty extensively at this point, trying to get ready for the playoff games. He was their best player when fully healthy. And there was a short period in the middle of the year where he was really healthy and clicking. He missed, he was out, got knocked out for the Ole Miss game, missed late in the year prior, was out the week before the Auburn game. He'd been hurt, got hurt in the LSU game, and was really limited versus Auburn. But when he played Tennessee, Texas A&M, he was a stud. Same thing, Jalen Key, some of their secondary members. McKinstry's been out a couple times. Arnold's been banged up. They haven't really clicked, but when they were there, you still saw certain times things they struggled with. It was actually a comment that I had passed down to me from a friend of mine who talked to one of the big defensive coaches in the SEC that had predicted Alabama would struggle defensively with Auburn. And there was an interesting factoid, and his point was Alabama's scheme is a two-gap scheme. They tend to use linemen to hold two gaps in the line of scrimmage, and they can have a hard time sometimes with pin and pull, which means you hold a guy and then you pull guys around because those big linemen, one, they don't move great in that scheme and they have a hard time getting in front of the pullers, and two, you don't have as many defensive linemen, so when they get hit with momentum, sometimes they get blown out of the hole and the linebackers struggle with guys in their face. Some teams do a little better against those schemes when they're more attacking, like a 4-3 front where everybody's got a guy and the linebacker's just shooting a gap. Well, when you pull, a guy shoots the gap and you blow up the play. Alabama's a little more reactive, so is Georgia. And so weirdly, they can struggle a little bit unless they have really dominant defensive linemen. And their linemen are very good, but they're not dominant. They don't have like a Terrence Cody type in the middle that can just, sit and plug. And so I think Michigan's run game is an interesting matchup because I think they do have the ability to do those things. You can't just wake up and run pin and pull, wake up and run power like that to that extent. It takes a lot of coordination and timing. Otherwise, you don't pull right. But the flip side of it is when they've been fully healthy, I've also seen an Alabama team that has such athleticism and linebacker. And let me be clear, I've seen some stuff from Michigan fans doing research where they talk about Alabama's linebacking core not being great. I've seen that from analysts. I do not agree. They haven't been great at times because they have rarely been healthy. They are going to be 100% healthy, and when healthy, they maybe can shoot those gaps. They are very athletic. And so there's just so many things flowing there in terms of scheme advantage, talent advantage, and that's what I'm sort of saying this is such an interesting matchup because a lot of this is hypothetical in terms of what's going to be dominant because I don't know that Alabama's played a power team that is nearly as good as Michigan, and I also don't think Michigan has played a team nearly as talented defensively as Alabama. And yes, I'm throwing Ohio State in there, who's a very good, maybe elite defense. Alabama's overall talent level, especially in the back end, is higher. They are faster than Ohio State. Their corners are better. Their linebackers are much better in lateral movement and explosion. And so it really creates sort of a dynamic situation.
Well, Josh, you touched on it there at the end, and there's two things for me that are I think pretty clear, and Ohio State fans might bristle at this. Alabama's got a much better offensive line, and Michigan fans are going to remember the stories in the press about the offensive line at the beginning of the year, not the one that dominated Georgia. Alabama's got a much better secondary than Ohio State. Denzel Burke would not start at either outside corner position for Alabama, true or false?
True, and I feel like I can comfortably say true because I'm not sure that Alabama doesn't have both of the best corners in the country. Their corner tandem is as good as Cincinnati's was when they made the playoff. With two guys that are now very good in the NFL. They are that good.
I agree with that. So another thing that's going to really maybe play one way or the other in this game, and we'll talk about how this game plays out in different sort of scoring tiers. But you mentioned that Michigan hasn't faced a team this talented, this athletic, and Alabama hasn't faced a team this good at power. There's a lot of firsts for both of these teams. Georgia's defense is excellent this year. I don't know that it's as good as Michigan's. I don't think it's as good as Michigan's. I think the statistics are a little skewed, and people will discount Michigan's defense because they didn't play anybody until, I think, November 11th that was worth anything. But even when you look at relative performance numbers, Michigan's defense is excellent. So people that are discounting that, they need to get over it. The one thing, Josh, that's interesting to me is Georgia completely misplayed Jalen Milroe. They had 2 spies, which I think we see now you can't do that. They had 2 spies. They let him sit back, and the time that he had, he beat them. He struggles with pressure, and he struggles when even the pocket holds up and there's delayed pressure, but the 2 spy thing didn't work. I'm sure that Michigan is still going to spy Jalen Milroe, but the question for me is, how hard is it for Michigan, having not played really they haven't played a good offense this year in general, like an elite offense, but Alabama's offense is an elite, but it has someone who is elite at running as a quarterback, and I don't think they've faced a really dynamic running quarterback in an offense that could reasonably put up points against them.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of things Alabama does that no one that Michigan plays can do, at least from a balanced sense. There's a lot of focus on who Milroe is as a runner. And people talk about, well, you got a running quarterback, you need to spy. The problem Georgia ran into, which everybody needs to understand, is when you spy, that player is useless for almost every other purpose on the field except spying. And so when you spy with 2 guys, you're effectively playing defense with 9. As if you were playing a pocket passer, it's like playing 9 guys on defense in every other way. And that meant that they couldn't hold the front because you got linebackers that are overly reactive, and it means in coverage those guys aren't very effective because they got to hover near the line of scrimmage. But it's kind of weird where the Big Ten is at right now in terms of overall offense, because the conference genuinely hasn't produced many effective passing games. Ohio State has the most dynamic receiver set, maybe the best receiver set in college football, but that's a hard thing to really gauge because the offensive tackle play was poor and the quarterback play was poor. When I went back and rewatched, in particular, the Michigan-Ohio State game, I was struck by how bad Kyle McCord really was in that game, and there were a couple things that showed. One, Michigan's pass rush unit is genuinely very good. I think it's something that could potentially give Alabama issues. I think it's something that can limit Alabama because they're so dependent on the deep passing game. But McCord is not mobile, and McCord didn't make good plays, and there really wasn't a lot of dynamicism from Ohio State's ability to run the ball. Ohio State's ability to throw vertical was non-existent because they couldn't pass block. Everything has to be within 15, 20 yards, and it makes things harder. In general, if you look at the 2 conferences, in terms of number of long passing plays this year, Ohio State actually leads the Big Ten in plays of 30 yards or more down the field and throwing the football. And that's caught at the line of scrimmage, behind the line of scrimmage, thrown downfield, whatever. They've only had 22 plays of 30 yards or more, and that's the most in the conference. Second is Maryland at 21. Third is Illinois. Fourth is Northwestern at 15. Says a lot that Northwestern's 15 is the 4th most of any team in the Big Ten in terms of long pass plays. It just isn't happening. In the SEC, LSU has 37. Alabama has 28. Ohio State's 22 would actually be tied with South Carolina and Texas A&M. So if you're a Big Ten fan and you're watching this preview, I want you to keep in mind that whatever you think of the given teams, Texas A&M and their offense, when you watch them on TV, has thrown the ball downfield more, had more explosive passing plays, or as many, as Ohio State has. That's the difference between the 2 conferences. Fourth in the Big Ten right now is Northwestern with 15. In the SEC, 15 would be 11th. It's Kentucky. Auburn has more long passing plays than that. So there's really just a huge divide between the 2 conferences, the type of offenses they faced. I think it's an interesting challenge for Michigan, but it's also one of those things where I think it just makes it unproven, right? Can Michigan actually deal with verticality? Can they deal with the ability to throw downfield? And I think it also changes the way Michigan plays defense, to your point, before I kick it back to you. Michigan has been able to play all year downhill. They know the ball really isn't going downfield because the pass rushers like Harrell and those guys are very good for Michigan. They haven't really given many teams the opportunity to throw vertically. I think that is to Michigan's credit. But it lets you play a particular style of football. Guys like Mikey Sanders-Still, I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He's a better version of Malachi Moore for Alabama. And just in terms of a senior guy that's dynamic, that has a nose for the football, Moore's probably not as talented as Sanders-Still. And those guys, when they're in a position where they can just constantly attack, keep their eyes in the backfield, are really effective. But Michigan very rarely has to turn and run. And with Alabama, they probably are going to turn and run, because this is the other stat I'll give before I flip it back. As you said, a lot of people make a big deal out of the sack numbers, right? Michigan, in terms of sacks allowed, Michigan's 33rd and Alabama's 124th in the country. But, and this is a big but, if you look at November games only, Alabama is 17th. Michigan is 43rd. Alabama was allowing 4 sacks per game in September, and they only allowed 1 sack per game in November. And they did play some decent pass rushers in that span. Auburn can rush the passer, Kentucky can. So things have shifted. It's not the same narrative for Alabama. And the team that creates is such an interesting dynamic matchup for Michigan that, again, at some level you have to admit the entire upper 2/3 of the SEC is really operating in a passing sphere that only maybe Ohio State and Maryland are at in the Big Ten, and Maryland and Ohio State aren't even as effective as the upper half of those teams in the SEC. So it creates a big question mark where you're trying to evaluate with your eyes rather than you are on paper.
Yeah, and there's a couple of narratives that I think don't matter. There's a few narratives that do not matter in this game. One, and I said it on Twitter the other day, the sign stealing thing doesn't matter at this point. You know, if that was helping Michigan, it was helping them early in the season or last year. Obviously, because they're under a microscope, they weren't doing it for Ohio State or Penn State. They're not going to be doing it in the Alabama game. So I think that is off the table as a narrative for this game. If Michigan wins this game, they're going to win it because they're the better team, not because they stole signs. You know, you can say what you want about them being good enough over the years to get there, but I think that this season right now, and even if they win it out, there's no star for me next to it. You might feel differently, but they're the champion if they win, because they have beaten 2 really good teams in the playoffs. They also beat 2 really good teams, Ohio State and Penn State. That's the other narrative, is a lot of people focus on Alabama early in the season because they want to whistle past the graveyard a lot compared to who they are now. And they focus on Michigan having not played anybody all year. And then they say, oh, well, since they stopped stealing signs, JJ McCarthy's stats are X, Y, and Z. Well, JJ McCarthy has also played 2 of the best defenses in the country in a 3-game span. They also played Maryland, who's not a terrible team. So for me,
and let me interject there.
Go ahead.
This is a big thing to me with a lot of these is McCarthy was injured. We know he was injured. He at least had a sprained ankle in the Maryland game. Couldn't use his legs, couldn't step into his throws. Both these teams, if you want to look at Alabama's defense, you want to look at Michigan's offense, and Roman Wilson went out in the Maryland game, and I was actually at that game. That affected them. It affected Alabama that they were not 100% defensively against Auburn. And I'm seeing way too many people take way too much from those games that had a lot of asterisk and context that really affected how those games went.
Yeah, I think that you give 2 teams a month off and they don't have any season-ending injuries to account for, you're going to get the best version of them, and a lot of the narratives don't matter. But the JJ one really bothers me because I think it's intellectually dishonest to say, look, his numbers fell off the second this stuff came out, therefore, conclusion. I don't like that at all. The other one is what you were talking about with Alabama, not just November, but like the South Florida game where they didn't even the guy that started quarterback in that game for Alabama just transferred to play lacrosse for Notre Dame. I mean, it's not the same team. Even the Texas game, like that was the second game of the year with 2 new coordinators and a new quarterback. This is a completely different Alabama team. And I'm not saying that Alabama is definitely going to beat Texas if they beat Michigan, but it's to compare those two is absurd. I don't think people realize how much growth, we talk about teams getting better throughout the course of the year. And this is something that I want you to talk about a little bit before we get into the model. Everybody reflexively said they throw out early season games because they say teams can get better. All teams get better over the course of the year. Yes, I think that is true. However, Some teams get worse due to injury, and other teams get tremendously better because of who they're breaking in, both at coach and at quarterback. And that, or any other pieces. When you have new faces everywhere, especially at coordinator, and they don't know how to call certain plays to fit the strengths of their personnel while live bullets are flying, they learn that throughout the course of the season. So the version at the end of the year is way different than the first. If you had to put a number on it, not a number, just to say, like, in terms of the teams whose beginning of the season matters the least, to me, it'd be like Arizona and Alabama.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it there too. There's just so many contextual points, right? So when you talk about like the USF game for Alabama, there are a couple things that happened in that game. One, Milroe didn't start, which is a thing everybody cites, but there were more than that. Two, it was a driving rainstorm. They had like an hour and a half rain delay. It was pouring rain for half the game. Nobody could move the ball. Alabama hardly gave up any yards in the game, which is the flip side because nobody could function in the weather. But the offensive line also wasn't settled. So Tyler Booker is, in my opinion, Alabama's version of Zenter, okay, at left guard. And he's one of the biggest things that drives that offense when it's running well. They like to run behind him. Yeah, he's a dominant interior offensive lineman. He did not play versus South Florida. They had a true freshman left tackle. They were still breaking in, the guy that struggled, and they were rotating him at left tackle. The other guy that was a more veteran player, Pritchett, who's also the guy that just got arrested with one of the weirder charges you'll ever find. I won't talk about that because I don't want to be demonetized. He was at left tackle, and then the right guard was a veteran guy they were playing, and they had some injury issues. The left guard, Booker, is back, and they were a completely different team with him. The right guard position got solidified by a redshirt freshman that had not really played yet at that point in the year. And the left tackle that was a true freshman is a completely different player today than he was in week 2. It reminds me a lot, actually, of what LSU was last year, that is 2022. Offensively, they were pretty bad the first half of the year, which people kind of forget. And the big key to that is they had 2 freshman offensive tackles, 2 5-star but freshman offensive tackles. The beginning of the year, they were a bad offense. They could not pass block. It's why actually they started Jaden Daniels over Nussmeier, because they were really sack prone. And by the end of the year, the offensive tackles had figured out what they were doing, use their talent level. That's when they beat Alabama. That's when they put up a lot of points on a great Georgia defense in the SEC title game. Alabama's got a lot of those same things. But again, the context of wasn't just their starting quarterback, it was also their version of Zenter out. The right guards knew. It's effectively 3 of the 5 offensive linemen you're playing if you're Michigan today were not really in that game. Either 2 of them weren't there, period. One was effectively not the same player. So the context is just completely and totally out the window. And I do want to make a note there for people that want to go back and watch games. I think if you're going to watch Alabama and watch them honestly, the 2 games I would say you got to watch. One would be the Texas A&M game. They were healthier defensively. It's a better showing. And the Kentucky game was their more dominant game. LSU's defense is so bad, I'm not sure it says a lot. And they were actually banged up defensively in that one. Michigan, sort of a similar deal, right? Like, I think the Ohio State game is a good showing for them, but in some ways they were a little more sputtery. Like, I think Penn State was a little more of a dominant defensive performance. Minnesota is an interesting one for me because Minnesota is a very good defense, and they just ran them over. And so you got to kind of go back and pick and choose, and those are the games I would actually rewatch, not the ones everybody cites because there's so many contextual points that happen.
Yeah, and I think that one of the interesting things for me is how the big games for Alabama, maybe Kentucky, but I don't think Kentucky is anywhere near Michigan's level. The good games for Alabama outside of Georgia are all teams that are so stylistically so different. Like Ole Miss is a very good team. They're number 11 in the country. They can put up a lot of points. They're not terrible on defense this year. LSU has the best offense in the country, but they're so bad on defense. Those teams are so far removed from Michigan, you can't really look at them and compare to what's going to happen in the Michigan game. It's kind of interesting in that way. In a lot of ways, Josh, to me, Georgia is the direct analog in terms of physicality, in terms of having dudes on both sides of the ball, and maybe not so much in, a guy like Brock Bowers, but the rest of the skill players are pretty similar because there's nobody for me, Michigan fans are going to be mad, but there's nobody for me at wide receiver for Georgia or Michigan that I'm like, oh man, that guy's, top 10 draft pick. That guy just isn't there. The running backs, I think, are better at Michigan. But in general, if I'm picking a team or a game to compare to, it's probably Georgia, which would mean it's probably going to be a pretty tight game because they're evenly matched. Let's get in the model, see what the model thinks, and then we'll have some discussion off of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll make one point there with Georgia. We had noted before that game that Georgia had a deficiency at edge rusher, a significant one of the worst in the conference in sacks and edge pressure. And I think that showed up big time, and that's not a problem Michigan has. But the flip side, and I'm sorry Michigan fans for saying this, but I think Georgia is a much more dynamic offense than Michigan. Carson Beck is a very good quarterback. They push the ball vertically. They've developed a lot of really dynamic downfield weapons. They're a higher ranked offense, like BC in FEI. They're third. Michigan's very good at fifth, but Georgia's even better. The model is pretty lopsided. Right now, it's sitting at Michigan 28, Alabama 17. It's an 11-point spread. The interesting thing there is the yard per play differential. We like to flag this is not that different. We flag this anytime it happens. Yard per play for Michigan is 5.37. Yard per play for Alabama is 5.14. I've been interviewed a couple times about models now from different sources. I was in AL.com on the Alabama side. They reached out to us because of our model and in anticipation of the game. Maybe Daniel, we can put a link to that article in there if anybody's curious to hear our thoughts on it. But the long and short is Alabama has an issue where, at least in our projection, we do scoring based on a holistic, self-trained model on what it takes for your team to score. Not just like points per yard, but sort of a machine learning approach model for like a scoring trajectory. And Alabama's low yardage performances often didn't have many points. Conversely, Michigan's had some games where they didn't move the ball at all and they scored a lot. And so that happened consistently enough where Michigan has a very, very high floor in our scoring model and everyone else's. Alabama has a very low floor because they've struggled to score so many times over the course of the year for one reason or another. And given the yardage projections, it's kind of interesting because Alabama is projected to throw the ball better. Neither team's expected to run well. 3 yards per carry for Alabama, but only 3.8 for Michigan. That's not effective. And the yard per play is almost exactly the same. The difference is just that Michigan is a more efficient offense off the same yardage. That's what's being flagged. The problem you see is the consistency score, which in our model reflects really if you took this data and then you applied it back over the course of the year. So you look at all the games they played, you look at the actual yardage, you look at all that stuff, and then we rerun the model for each one of the actual games and we compare the two. Alabama's consistency between what is modeled and what actually happened is a score of 59, which is quite low. Michigan's at 29 is extremely low. And that's not just that they've had a few weeks where they struggled in recent weeks. There's also a lot of times previously our model would not have had them winning by nearly as much of a margin as they did. And so they're kind of all over the place. And so it's interesting. You end up with this 11-point spread, despite what is actually a very close model in terms of yardage performance. And the thing that I think that reflects is where Vegas is at, because this line's only on 1.5. And, as I've noted previously, all the computer models are coming out somewhere around 10 points that I've seen. Things like FEI, FPI, everybody, for the most part, seems to think this is about a 10-point margin if you're a computer. No one with eye test thinks that. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way the scoring floors and ceilings work. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact, as we often say, when you have isolated conference data points, Michigan did not play a Power 5 out of conference this year. The data just kind of lives in different universes and sometimes doesn't really mean anything relative to each other in out-of-conference play. And I think it also says a lot about how inconsistent Alabama is. But however you want to take it, this is very much a game where computer scoring has Michigan with a big edge. No one with eye test agrees with it, including Vegas. They very much think it's not. Interestingly, our yardage is much more in line with like a 1.5 spread. If you didn't know the two teams and you told me the yardage margin, a 1.5 is about where you'd land, which may say a lot about how Vegas came up with that number. But I do think ultimately there's a real argument that the advanced metrics, sharp, power rating side of Vegas says Michigan should be favored by a lot. The eye test may even be saying Alabama should be favored. And the point and a half is kind of hedging the two. Somewhere in between, maybe shifted more towards eye test, I'm not sure. But nobody really knows what to do with this game. And even our model, if you look at scoring versus yardage, it's not entirely consistent. It doesn't really make a ton of sense.
So for me, there's two issues here in terms of both teams, and this is what makes it kind of hard to pick. Alabama is the more dynamic team. They're the more athletic team. They're the more talented team. They have more explosive players, but they're also the more inconsistent team. And for me, that's where it's really hard to pick this game. Alabama, if you look at all of their big games this year, outside of LSU, whose defense is trash, they scored 27 against Georgia. The week before, 27 against Auburn. Both those games were 27-24. 27 offensive points against Tennessee, which was the game, the big game before that. 26 versus A&M. 24 versus Ole Miss, 24 versus Texas. Alabama is going to score between 24 and 27 points in this game, in my opinion. I think that's just kind of the style of how they play. I think it bakes in and reflects the fact that they're going to burn. Alabama's offense is going to waste a quarter in this game. Bama fans, get ready for it. It's just going to happen. They do it every single game that matters, even the ones that don't. That they're just so inconsistent, and it's just some of it is, there's an example of Alabama was in desperate need to get a first down against Georgia when they opened that game. They went 3 and out, and they gave up the big touchdown, got the ball back, and then they had a 3rd and 4. They needed a first down like they needed air, like they needed oxygen. And Jalen Milroe throws with a pretty clean pocket and has guys open underneath. He throws a boundary fade to Burton, and he's double covered, and he overthrew him by like 10 yards. That happens enough, or he takes a sack. That happens enough to this Alabama offense that they don't score consistently. It's very herky-jerky, and they melt a lot of clock. So does Michigan. On one hand, I think Alabama's going to find points through explosion, but they're going to be wildly inconsistent. On the other hand, I could see Michigan, even though Corum is a great red zone guy, I could see Michigan being much more consistent moving the ball and having a hard time scoring touchdowns, which really, really makes me struggle with this. I've got Alabama winning 27-24 with the caveat that if this game, even though Alabama's the more explosive offense, if this game gets in the 30s, I think Alabama loses.
Yeah. I have a similar thinking to you on this in a lot of ways. I actually have Alabama winning this 24-17, which is a pretty low-scoring game, but not that low, right? I mean, that's a 41-point game. The current over-under is 44.5. Both these teams have issues scoring points, but for very different reasons. Alabama has the ability to move the ball much better than Michigan does. When they're clicking and executing well, Alabama has better tools than Michigan. Michigan's backs are very good. I think Donovan Edwards creates matchup problems, etc. Alabama just has more weapons. Alabama's backs are quite good. McClellan's been hurt. When he's back, he was a 5-star tailback for a reason. The 3rd-string guy was a 5-star tailback. The 4th-string guy was a 5-star tailback. The biggest issues in the running game has been the offensive line not clicking. But against the Georgia game, they did click. And when they did click and executed well, they ran the ball pretty darn well. And then outside between Bond and Burton and really the rest of that receiving core, they have good weapons. It is a better receiving core than Michigan has. And even you take a guy like Loveland in Michigan, which was really their key in the Ohio State game, in my opinion, because of a matchup situation. Alabama has guys like that and guys like Niblack. They've got Dupree, the transfer from Maryland, who's very good, but more used as a blocker. Like they've just got weapons across the board, and they have a very dynamic player at quarterback. The problem is the execution between all those guys is just not there on a consistent basis. When it is there, they move the ball very well. They can drive down the field. They can score quickly. The Auburn game looked like it was going to be 21-0 before you could blink. Then a 4th down play got called back for a holding call, which might have been questionable, maybe not. Auburn turned around and scored. Suddenly it's 14-7, and then ended up being a quick game. It turned on its face very quickly. But that is the problem for Alabama. In my view, this game is fairly simple conceptually, but very hard to predict for one reason. It's going to come down to whether or not Excuse me, I've been very sick all week. That's why the videos are a bit late. It's going to come down to whether or not Alabama makes mistakes, because the biggest thing Michigan has going for them, they're a very veteran team. They're a veteran defense. They're a veteran offense. They do not beat themselves. They tend to always move the ball forward. If you make a mistake, a bad throw, they will capitalize. At some level, when people want to say things like, oh, against Iowa, oh, against Ohio State, they got easy touchdowns. Yeah, it's because they created those opportunities. And when the other team gave them a gift, they took advantage. They turned around. They punched it in the red zone. Alabama's had times this year, like the Texas A&M game, they ran a punt back. It got called back for a penalty, and I think they ended up punting. Like, that happens to them all the time. So if Alabama can execute well enough and not gift the game over, they will win. But LSU game might be the only game I've seen from them where they executed, especially offensively, at a high level for the entire game. Auburn, the defense didn't execute well, and the offense didn't execute well. Yeah, Kentucky, yeah, I'd agree with that. Kentucky's probably the other game where they executed at a high level for the entirety of the game. When they're in that mode, they are the best team in college football right now, and they will win this game. They have only been that mode for 2 or 3 games. I think they have enough in them with the long layoff, being healthier, getting everybody on the same page. You know, they had some alignment issues. Guys like Caleb Downs, phenomenal football player, but he's a true freshman. And so he's making plays all over the field, one of the best alley defenders I've seen in years. I can't even give him a comp. He's just that good. He's kind of a unique guy, but he actually gets out of position sometimes in the back end and gives up big plays. If over the course of a month and watching tape they can get that crap together, they're going to be really hard to stop. And that was one of the big things against LSU is they came out of a bye week. And that's the one thing informing my opinion here is I'm making the assumption the way they played against LSU was indicative of the fact that when they had time to over-prepare for an opponent, they kind of wrinkled out a lot of the issues they have as a football team and they executed at a higher level. But if they make mistakes, if they throw short yardage interceptions, give bad opportunities, have penalties, have one of those games like they did against Auburn, Michigan will absolutely win because they are not going to make those kinds of mistakes. I think they're number 1 in the country right now in penalties, and they're tremendously good at taking advantage of opportunities. So that's a very hard thing for me to predict. So I want you guys to understand that with a prediction. But if you want to take my real prediction, it's this. And I know people say this all the time, and it's a cliche, but it's genuinely true here. This game is going to hinge on whether or not Alabama can actually execute their game or whether they don't execute their game. Because Michigan is probably not as good as Alabama's ceiling, but they are the sort of team that will absolutely take advantage of anything that Alabama decides to handle.
I think both sides should be prepared for a short game, which usually means a pretty stressful game in these scenarios, because I don't think anybody's going to be comfortable. You mentioned Loveland, and that's one note that I had because Michigan fans are going to say we've got this weapon, and he does present matchup, issues, but Downs on the other side, except for 2 plays, completely shut down Bowers, and he took him away schematically. And the reason they could afford him to really just follow Bowers around the field is because the rest of the secondary is so good that they can play man up on everybody and not need Downs to kind of float in space and handle things where other people don't have that luxury. I don't think he's going to be a huge factor in this game, but I also think the running backs could be a huge factor in a game that they haven't been against Alabama previously. One other note, you mentioned big plays and people kind of take that away from Michigan. I agree. It's frustrating because if a team consistently is successful in what people call trick plays, it's because their offense is putting so much pressure on the defense at 4 and 5 yards of play that they have to sell out to stop, to force a negative play to get them off the field, and that's when they hurt you. The last thing I'll say about this is I think Alabama's probably poised to make better in-game adjustments. I like their coordinators better. There's just a little more experience, especially at defensive coordinator, having been there and done that a little bit more. I know Mentor's got some years at Georgia State, but really Moore and Mentor are 2021 season, and now is their real big boy coordinator experience calling plays, and I like Alabama side a little bit more than that. Josh, anything else before we wrap up this super long episode?
Yeah, and I just want to expound on something you said, and this is the other reason why I have Alabama winning right now. Quite frankly, the problem for me when I look at Michigan is Michigan's offense. I don't know if Alabama is going to give up some cheap scores, but Michigan's offense, I'm not really sure where on the field they're going to get an advantage. I mean, Iowa, they struggled offensively. They moved the ball between the 20s. Now, Iowa's a bend but don't break defense. And a lot of the best defenses in the Big Ten are because they don't have many vertical passing offenses, and you can get away with that a little bit, and you can play efficiency ball. Alabama has the athletes to man up one-on-one, and be it the Alabama's corners are significantly better than Michigan's receivers. I think Roman Wilson is a very good corner. Alabama's corners are just elite. At safety, probably the worst player is probably Jalen Key, and he's an upper half player. Caleb Downs is kind of exceptional and could cover. A guy like Loveland, he's going to be able to effectively cover him one-on-one. Even Edwards flexing out, most of Alabama's linebackers and safeties can run with him, which is probably not something I'm not sure any other Big Ten team can say that. And so it's got to be an execution-based offense, and I think the only way that works is if Michigan runs the ball well. And without Zinter against Iowa, they didn't have that running game, and the other stuff didn't come into play. And that's kind of the other side of this coin to me is I think if Zinter was there, I'd have a little more confidence in Michigan's ability to run straight up. Without him there, I get more concerned. And I think there's a real danger here for Michigan that if Alabama puts up points and Michigan has some pressure to score, they may start to just flail because I'm not sure there is any way for Michigan to manufacture yardage. I'm not sure there's any matchup that they can abuse on Alabama. They have to be bread and butter offense. They have to be pin and pull, power offensive football, and they have to be successful because this Alabama defense, when healthy, is very, very, very good. And I'm not sure there's really anywhere else in the field where Michigan has an advantage to be successful. I just don't see it.
All right, y'all, let us know in the comments who you think is going to win this game. Remember, you can check out all the statistics and model on collegefootballnerds.com that we talked about in this episode. Hope y'all have a great holiday season. God bless.